the United States is the foundation and source of legal authority underlying its federal system of government and overall existence. It also defines the three main branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. The Constitution specifies the powers and duties of each branch of government and was devised to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful, highlighting the principles of separation of powers and the system of checks and balances. The first 10 amendments, being known as the Bill of Rights, were in effect part of the original constitutional settlement drafted by the 55 founding fathers. Any proposed amendment must secure a two-thirds vote of members present in both houses. Then three-quarters of the state legislatures have to ratify the proposed change. The founding fathers clearly wished to create a system that was in sharp contrast to and more democratic than the monarchical system of absolute power in Britain at the time. However, the weakness of the American system is that government is slow, complicated, and legalistic. U.S. political parties have a key role in the organization and running of democratic government. Their basic purpose was and is to nominate candidates for public office and get as many as possible elected. Then, once elected, these officials hope to achieve the goals of their party by making laws, creating policy initiatives, and passing legislation. As well as representing individuals, political parties often represent interest groups with specific concerns. In the USA, most politicians come from either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party came to be an upholder of states' rights and defend the views of the slave-holding southern states, detesting its support for African American civil rights and preferring to maintain white supremacy. The Republican Party was founded by anti-slavery campaigners and modernizers in 1854. One of their key features was the end of slavery. It was also a pro-business and banking, advocating high import tariffs to promote economic growth and protect U.S. industry. The electoral system. Presidents usually come from either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Each state gets a certain number of electors based on its total number of representatives in Congress. Each elector casts one electoral vote following the general election. There are a total of 538 electoral votes. The candidate that gets more than half wins the election. The idea of giving people the power to make important decisions is seen as a key democratic principle. The role and significance of leaders. FDR's New Deal possibly saved democracy in the USA. FDR guided the USA from the brink of social, economic, and possibly political breakdown to a position by 1941 where the combined impact of all his reforms had alleviated the worst effects of the Great Depression on the most vulnerable and had returned manufacturing production to its 1929 level. He inspired confidence, he was a man of charisma, and he was a hope for a new start. He strengthened and reshaped the U.S. presidency following a period of inertia. He created a modern America, expanding political and constitutional powers. Another leader was John F. Kennedy. He proposed the civil rights legislation, which most of it was carried through by Lyndon B. Johnson. He was a symbol of the new changes many Americans wished to see. He played a significant role in modernizing U.S. politics and also created the New Frontier approach in dealing with problems at home, abroad, and in space. Perhaps most controversially, Kennedy involved the USA in the military defense of South Vietnam. Another leader was Lyndon B. Johnson. He was known for his determination to build on Kennedy's legislative beginnings and sought to use the power of the federal government to improve the lives of millions. Some historians consider his presidency did benefit millions with its emphasis on education, healthcare, and civil rights and made the USA more democratic. Another leader was Richard Nixon. He signed agreements with the USSR. In 1972, unemployment was caused because of budget deficit. The Vietnam War and the Great Society policies made by Johnson were affecting the economy. The USA was affected by an oil embargo introduced by Saudi Arabia. There were three factors that influenced the evolution of democracy in the United States: immigration, economic forces, and foreign policy. The hostilities that arose by U.S. citizens towards immigrants caused the government to begin cracking down on the issue due to the growing feeling that foreigners represented a threat to democracy. These actions caused immigrants to unconditionally support the Democratic Party as Franklin D. Roosevelt began to democratize the lives of these people, giving them the opportunity to participate in the affairs of the state and making their vote and opinion count. Lyndon Johnson also enacted the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 with the purpose of increasing immigration to the United States, especially from Latin America and Asia. In the 1890s, the United States expanded its economic structure thanks to the abundance of resources, new technologies, and the shift from the trade to manufacturing. It was a time of economic boom for many companies that merged and formed large companies. However, small businesses, farmers, and their workers often ended up in ruin because there was no point of comparison when it came to competing against larger companies. Some historians suggesting that there was an undemocratic undertone where powerful unelected industrialists effectively ran the United States in the absence of dynamic politicians. Although between 1920 and 1929, the United States experienced widespread prosperity, this development did not reach all people. It left behind the urban poor, small farmers, African Americans, and the unemployed. In the period from 1933 to 1969, the economy and democracy were saved by Franklin D. Roosevelt for the policies of the New Deal and his good management of the federal government. John F. Kennedy for the quick response he faced in the face of economic recessions and the support provided to the people so that they could all prosper together. And Lyndon B. Johnson, who continued with the plans to implement Kennedy's reforms for the construction of the Great Society. The most significant foreign influences during this period were foreign culture, the Red Scare, and the Vietnam War. Prohibition caused a massive increase in organized crime and corruption. This would lead to an end in March 1933 with the 21st Amendment, due to a massive shift in public opinion due to problems that arose from the law. Red Fear unleashed raids on magazine offices, union headquarters, and private homes, with the purpose of purging the anarchists and communists. This caused thousands of people to be detained in prison without a hearing. They were also deported and faced with prejudiced judges. The Vietnam War greatly impacted U.S. domestic politics between 1964 and 1969. It dramatically influenced future events on home front by dragging the U.S. into an all-consuming foreign policy. It siphoned off funds needed for further social reform and caused the downfall of a president while dramatically altering the way future presidents thought about military interventions. How did the government respond to internal crisis? There was a depression in 1893 with President Cleveland. From the beginning, he did little to combat the recession. He believed that the business cycle was a natural phenomenon and that it would correct itself. When Jacob Coxey suggested a program of public works and even made a march on Washington, Cleveland did not flinch at all, believing that the government should not sponsor work projects to alleviate the depression. Many feared the United States would face the beginning of presidential tyranny. Cleveland was seen by many as an unsympathetic bully who only cared about protecting his presidential power. His responses to the crisis revealed how oblivious he was to this situation. FDR and the banking crisis of 1932. Immediately after Roosevelt took office, he ordered all banks to close. He then created the Emergency Banking Law. The Glass-Steagall Act judiciously prevented large commercial banks from turning to investment banking. He immediately realized that he had inherited a society that had lost faith in many of its own institutions, and democracy or the rule of law could be next. The scandal Watergate of 1972. Nixon took immediate action to cover up this crime. He raised secret money for the thieves and obstructed the FBI from investigating this incident by destroying evidence and firing uncooperative members of his staff and administration. Facing impeachment from Congress after his role in the Watergate conspiracy had been fully exposed, Nixon resigned. His successor, Gerald Ford, immediately pardoned Nixon. In the eyes of many, Ford dealt poorly with this aspect of the crisis. Watergate forever changed American politics, prompting the public to question its presidency and political leaders. It also demonstrated the strengths of the American system. Nixon was forced to leave office due to public outcry. However, an inherent weakness was demonstrated in that the system itself neither guarded against Nixon's presidential excess of power nor detected them when they first happened. How did the government react to protest movements? The populist movement of the late 1800s was the largest indigenous democratic mass protest movement in American history. It grew out of an agrarian revolt in the South and Midwest against both political parties for appearing disinterested in their problems. In 1892, they had formed the Populist Party. This party challenged the corporate state and the ideology it represented. The Populist Party contested the presidential elections of 1892 with the two main parties alarmed by this protest party. Although they did not win, the Populists obtained more than 1 million votes and took 4 states. Populists challenged white supremacy by forming coalitions with black farmers. By 1896, the Populists had largely merged with the Democratic Party.
Few moments later,
the Populists slowly declined. The suffrage and emancipation of women. The campaign for women's suffrage began in the 1820s when the first articles written by women appeared in publications. They advocated for the vote of women. Its first successes occurred in 1869 when the Wyoming Territory gave the vote to women. Then Utah in 1870, Colorado in 1893, and Idaho in 1896. On the eve of President Wilson's inauguration in 1913, suffrage activists marched in a parade in Washington, D.C. They were attacked by a mob and hundreds of women were injured, several seriously, but no arrests were made. President Wilson now knew that this was becoming a serious problem and an international embarrassment. So in January 1918, he announced that women's suffrage was urgently needed as a war measure. In August 1920, the 19th Amendment was certified by the Secretary of State, when all states finally ratified and legalized it. At a more popular level, public acceptance of salaried jobs for young single women was now growing. American women in the 1920s now worked in offices, shops, and department stores, and their career opportunities were no longer limited to domestic service or housework in mills or factories. As the Vietnam War dragged on and became increasingly unwinnable, an increasing number of Americans were angered by the rising casualties, by the increasing number of people joining the draft to place the deaths and injuries and escalating costs. In November 1965, 40,000 protesters surrounded the White House calling for an end to the war. On the same day, President Johnson announced a troop increase in Vietnam from 120,000 to 400,000.
much later,
Richard Nixon launched a new massive bombing campaign and later advocated for Vietnamization. When cornered, the United States withdrew from the war and the prisoners were released. The anti-war movement made Americans think and reevaluate their democracy. Policies to promote economic growth. Harding wanted to reduce unemployment and further boost American industry. He created the U.S. Budget Office to monitor, streamline, and reform U.S. government spending, with a focus on reducing waste and providing value for money. The federal debt was reduced by about a third. When Calvin Coolidge became president, he lowered income taxes in line with significant reductions in federal spending. This thanks to the passage of the revenue laws of 1924 and 1926. But the Wall Street crash in 1929 put an end to all prosperity. Economic policies thereafter brought minimal relief and benefited few U.S. citizens. By 1920, older commodity industries were falling behind as new growth industries developed. The collapse of prices in the 1920s brought with it the inevitable brutal financial crash. The laissez-faire policies of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover overlooked the men and women of the rural interior. The welfare network for them was the church and its community of family, friends, and neighbors. But in an era of low food and cotton prices, the result was often a life of disillusionment, foreclosures, and deep poverty. Roosevelt established a series of agencies to help vulnerable sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, and provide employment. They became known as the Alphabet Agencies. The first set of legislation focused primarily on business needs and with the goal of promoting economic growth. Then he introduced the Second New Deal, which stopped a downward spiral and fostered some of the fastest gains in production, employment, and business profitability in American history. When Kennedy took office, the economy wasn't at its best. He responded with policies to lower taxes, protect the unemployed, promote job creation, increase the minimum wage, and stimulate the economy. Military spending in the Vietnam War also created jobs in munitions and defense, increasing both employment and army recruitment. Nixon assumed the presidency in 1969. He implemented certain policies to combat inflation, introducing temporary price and wage controls. By the end of his presidency in 1974, inflation was at 12% after the Middle East War and its subsequent oil crisis. He ushered in a decade of price instability, rising inflation rates. The U.S. economy would undergo even greater restructuring. American citizens in the mid-1970s were no longer in any advantageous positions. They were prepared to face even more difficult social and economic problems. Policies to extend education. In the 1920s, the American business community wanted the government to promote education, especially in public high schools, but as the Depression began, suddenly many in the business world opposed public funding of education. It would come from taxes, but entrepreneurs now needed tax breaks and lamented that the money was going to education. FDR realized that schools, teachers, and students had suffered greatly. As part of Roosevelt's response to the crisis, he allocated $20 million in federal money to provide immediate assistance and help protect schools in danger of closure. The New Deal's tendency to target individuals revealed major flaws in the U.S. educational system, with much illiteracy and a shortage of key skills discovered. In just over 7 years, the WPA built nearly 6,000 schools, while the NYA, fostering education and providing jobs for part-time students, established a NYA division to ensure that African Americans also benefited from NYA schemes and the WPA. Kennedy succeeded in pushing through the Higher Education Facilities Act of 1963, which allowed nearly $150 million for graduate schools in language, science, and engineering. Then Johnson passed the Economic Opportunity Act that established the Office of Economic Opportunity. In 1965, the ESEA was passed. It helped all school districts, with more money going to districts with a large proportion of students from poor families. Johnson's second major bill was the Higher Education Act of 1965, which funded low-income students, giving them money to work and study and government loans. President Nixon valued learning. He had declared the existence of racism to be America's greatest moral failure. He married the two problems when embarking on the first large-scale racial integration of schools in the South, but he had to walk a middle road between segregationists and liberal Democrats. The segregation eventually occurred. In 1968, 68% of black children in the South attended all-black schools, and by 1974 that number had fallen to 8%. Policies to improve health and provide social welfare. In 1906, Roosevelt introduced the Meat Inspection Act for the purpose of improving health and safeguarding food consumption, and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 prohibited the adulteration or false labeling of food and drugs. Also, President Wilson established the Department of Labor in 1913. Laws were passed and agencies related to child welfare, workplace safety, minimum wages, housing, sanitation, and worker illness were established. The 1920s were characterized by a relative lack of legislation and government initiatives on health and social welfare. The key piece of legislation in this decade was the Shepard-Towner Childhood and Maternity Act of 1921. It distributed federal grants to states for prenatal and infant health care clinics, midwife training, and visiting nurses for pregnant women and new mothers. It also promoted information on nutrition and hygiene. As such, it became the first federally funded welfare measure in the United States. Unfortunately, this law was allowed to expire in 1929, so the facility was not available when help was most needed, with the onset of the Great Depression. In 1935, the Second New Deal arrived with provisions to improve health and provide social welfare and security against disease, old age, and unemployment. The Social Security Act was passed, but its disadvantage was a lack of sickness benefits and no publicly funded health care program. When Kennedy arrived at the presidency, he recommended hospital insurance as well as other wellness measures. With Johnson's victory, millions of seniors received help from the Medicare Amendment to the Social Security Act, which provides free health care for the elderly and is paid out of Social Security taxes. Johnson then went further with the Medicaid Act, which provided for the welfare of recipients in the same way that Medicare provided for the elderly. Nixon created the Family Assistance Plan, replacing programs like food stamps and Medicaid with direct cash payments to those in need. Those with jobs below wages would also now qualify for financial aid, and support would not be limited to single-parent families. Policies to improve the position of women. Beginning in the 1910s, women had begun to influence government in different ways through different organizations. They even managed to secure the creation of the Office for Children in 1912 and then the Office for Women in 1920. In 1917, the first woman was elected to Congress, and finally, in 1819, President Wilson initiated legislation that became the 19th Amendment in August 1920. In 1938, the FLSA did not cover most female workers, and even though women also found employment through the WPA, they were in very low-paying jobs. The New Deal legislation took for granted the idea that women are paid a lower rate than men. Kennedy established the Commission on the Status of Women in December 1961. It was the first presidential committee to specifically address these gender issues. In 1963, Kennedy introduced the Equal Pay Act, which required equal pay for women and men who worked the same jobs under the same conditions. Johnson's Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in employment on the basis of color, race, ethnicity, religion, or gender by employers and private unions. In 1971, Nixon instructed Commerce Secretary Barbara to recruit qualified women for management positions. In fact, Nixon's administration was more advocate for women than might appear at first glance. The policies of his administration had proven to be more beneficial to women in the U.S. than what could have been anticipated. Policies to create a more equitable distribution of wealth. Inequality was something that was present in the 1920s. In the 1930s, the bottom 90% of the population owned only 16% of the wealth of the United States. Between 1930 and 1945, the share of total wealth among the middle classes increased. In the war decade after 1945, the United States economy reached levels unprecedented since the 1920s. But prosperity was unevenly distributed. Kennedy established the Area Redevelopment Administration in 1961, but this went too far, trying to help too many communities. Johnson launched his anti-poverty program in March 1964, introducing the Economic Opportunity Act to Congress. Poverty was highest among African Americans, but there was an unequal income distribution among whites, and poverty was more common among families who were sick, with little education, and with single-parent women. While nearly 66% of African American children lived below the poverty line in 1965, Johnson's policies lowered that number to 39.6% in 1969, a tremendous achievement. The overall poverty rate was cut in half from 22.4% in 1959 to 12.1% in 1969. Nixon used the presidential veto to stop incomplete Democratic initiatives on health, education, and welfare benefits, preferring that financial assistance be put through a means test. Cultural impact, freedom of expression in the arts and media. Cultural change developed rapidly in the 1920s or the Jazz Age. This was an era of innovation in which music came directly from African American culture. Jazz influenced the new styles of dance, but the more conservative parts of the United States did not like this new music and its decadent dance styles. With the expansion of magazines and the growing adoration of the Hollywood, California-based film industry, Americans sought to escape the boredom of the daily grind. Arrived in 1927, the Hollywood film industry grew astronomically in popularity, influence, and prestige. Literature and art also enjoyed their greatest heyday since the 1890s. America in the 1930s was unified by the same songs, news, and movies. Local radio had started in 1921 and grew rapidly. People now watched and read about the same sports stars, danced the same dances, and bought the same consumer goods. The years 1920 to 1941 culturally transformed the United States and homogenized the American culture, allowing for a democratic flowering of expression in the arts and the media. By 1960, more than 50% of the population enjoyed a middle-class lifestyle. Stanley Kurtz, in Culture and Values in the 1960s, comments that neighborhood friendships and local civic organizations never completely disappeared, but people's social life and friendships were increasingly shaped by choice and by sharing common beliefs. Then, movements began to merge around the issue of resistance to oppression. With the democratic freedom of expression existing in the arts, the media, and the streets, a counterculture soon developed. It was fueled by opposition to the Vietnam War, the injustice of racial discrimination, and the growing demands for equal opportunity. During Nixon's presidency, the American film industry in the late 1960s and 1970s flourished with this new artistic freedom. A new generation of bold and talented filmmakers brought representative values of the counterculture and introduced themes previously prohibited. They spoke for a generation disillusioned by war and angry with the political elite. They were culturally important in helping nurture modern, independent American cinema and capturing the human drama of everyday life. But American democracy made that change, that rebellion possible. The arts and media in the 1960s and 1970s were more politicized than ever, and American culture was more diverse than before. But since democracy is possibly not what we have but what we do, the turbulent artistic changes of these decades are leaving proof of the true impact of democracy on culture.